the ability to have somebody who is kind of epitomizes what you think your country stands for has always been a major ambition. And it's a huge advantage if you have somebody who can be recognized as that, and not just in your country, but around the world.
Okay, Princess Anne forced open Camilla's wardrobe and found the late Queen's coronation robe. Take a look at this for a moment, because according to the account now surrounding this extraordinary palace discovery, Anne allegedly ordered a locked section of Queen Camilla's wardrobe opened after palace records failed to explain where one of the late Queen Elizabeth II's most important ceremonial garments had gone. And when that door finally gave way, the missing piece of history was reportedly sitting behind Camilla's own clothes. Now, watch this. This is what makes the story different. The shock was not simply that Anne allegedly found the late Queen's coronation robe inside Camilla's wardrobe. The real question was why a garment connected to one of the most important moments in British royal history was reportedly sitting there without a clear trail in the inventory, explaining how it arrived, who moved it, or why nobody had raised the alarm before that moment. Okay, stay with this, because Anne was not reportedly searching for a scandal. She was trying to settle a discrepancy. But the moment that locked wardrobe became part of the conversation, a routine search allegedly turned into something nobody in that room could easily explain. And once the first door was opened, there was no putting this story back where it had been hidden. The question is simple. If Princess Anne found something that should have been accounted for, would silence protect the royal family, or would silence protect the person who put it there? Hi viewers, if you believe the late Queen's legacy deserves to be protected, would you speak up if you found something that did not belong where it was hidden? Because that is the pressure sitting over this entire story. One locked wardrobe, one historic garment, one inventory that reportedly does not line up. And Princess Anne standing in front of a door that, according to the dramatic account, was not supposed to become anyone else's business. But Anne has never been known for treating an uncomfortable situation as something that disappears simply because everyone in the room wishes it would. The atmosphere had already changed before anyone touched the wardrobe. There were staff moving in and out of the room. Garments had reportedly been checked. Storage references were being compared. Names, dates, and item descriptions were being pulled against physical locations. On the surface, it was the kind of work that rarely becomes a story. A garment is requested. A record is checked. A member of staff retrieves it. The day continues. Except this time, the record did not settle the question. It made the question worse. Somewhere inside the chain of information, according to the account, there was a gap. Not a dramatic gap at first. Nothing that would have stopped the entire palace in its tracks. Just one detail that refused to fit. The location attached to the ceremonial item did not appear to match where the search had been taking place. Another reference reportedly pointed towards storage that had already been checked. A third detail, small enough to be dismissed by someone in a hurry, suggested that the garment had either been moved or recorded under circumstances that no longer made sense.
People don't change that much. I think they recognize those people whose commitment has been constant, and they know that those standards are not changing.
That was when Anne reportedly stopped treating the matter as an ordinary mistake. And that was when attention shifted toward Camilla's wardrobe. Take a second and picture the moment. A room filled with clothing that had places, labels, histories, occasions, everything arranged, everything belonging somewhere. That kind of order can be reassuring until one detail refuses to cooperate. Then order becomes camouflage. According to the dramatic account, Anne's attention settled on a section of the wardrobe that was locked. At first, that fact alone did not prove anything. A private wardrobe can contain private belongings. That is hardly unusual. But the problem, according to the story, was no longer about privacy. The problem was about an item that palace records suggested needed to be accounted for. and suddenly, the locked doors were standing between a question and an answer. Nobody reportedly rushed toward them. That is important. The tension in stories like this does not come from people shouting and throwing accusations across a room. It comes from the opposite, from the silence that follows a question nobody wants to answer too quickly. Anne allegedly asked who had access. The answer did not immediately settle the matter. She reportedly asked whether the section had been checked. Again, uncertainty. And that was the point when the air in the room began to change. Because a locked wardrobe can remain a private space until someone has a reason to believe that what is inside it may not belong only to the person who owns the clothes around it. Now, the story surrounding this moment makes one thing clear. Anne allegedly did not arrive with a theatrical plan to expose Camilla. There was no grand announcement, no audience, no cameras waiting for a confrontation. That is precisely why the discovery, if the account is accurate, becomes so uncomfortable. The people in the room were reportedly dealing with the problem before they had time to prepare an explanation for it. Anne looked at the records, then at the locked section, then back at the people around her, and according to the account, she made the decision that pushed the entire situation past the point of being quietly ignored. The wardrobe had to be opened. That was the moment the room divided. Not openly, not with anyone declaring a side, but silence has its own language. Someone can hesitate, someone can look away, someone can suddenly become very interested in a document. And sometimes, the strongest objection is not spoken at all. The request to open the wardrobe was reportedly met with resistance or uncertainty. The details of exactly who said what remain part of the disputed account, but the central claim remains the same. Anne did not back away. The question had changed. It was no longer, can this wardrobe remain closed? It was, what happens if the thing everyone is searching for is behind that door? And once that possibility entered the room, the locked section stopped looking like furniture. It became evidence. Okay, now stay with this part, because the first thing Anne reportedly noticed was not a crimson robe lying openly in front of her. That would have been too simple. The wardrobe itself was orderly. Garments were arranged.
And he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support.
Formal clothing was stored. Accessories were reportedly placed where they belonged. Nothing jumped out and announced itself. For a few seconds, the search appeared to have produced absolutely nothing. And that is exactly when a person begins to wonder whether they have pushed too far, whether the suspicion was wrong, whether the locked door had contained nothing more than what it was always supposed to contain. According to the account, Anne kept looking. That detail matters because the entire story turns on the difference between seeing and actually noticing. Anyone can open a wardrobe. Not everyone notices what does not belong inside it. Somewhere among the carefully stored clothing, there was reportedly a garment bag, older than the others, different, not matching the system surrounding it. It was not simply the presence of a bag that drew attention. It was the absence of the kind of identification that should have made the item easy to explain. That was the first real chill. A room full of labels, a collection organized around order, and then one object that, according to the dramatic account, could not immediately explain itself. Anne reportedly moved closer. The people around her were now watching. And this is where the story slows down. Because sometimes the most dangerous moment is not the discovery. It is the second before confirmation. The second when everyone has seen enough to suspect the truth, but nobody has yet said it aloud. The garment bag was reportedly opened, and then came the color, crimson, heavy fabric, ceremonial in appearance. a material carrying the kind of visual weight that immediately separates it from ordinary royal clothing. For a moment, according to the account, there was no need for anyone to explain what they were looking at. The reaction came first. The explanation came later. Anne had reportedly found the item at the center of the search. The late Queen Elizabeth II's coronation robe. Not a replica, not a modern tribute, not an outfit inspired by history. According to the dramatic version of events, this was the garment that palace staff had been trying to locate, sitting inside Camilla's locked wardrobe. And suddenly, the entire room was staring at a discovery that created more questions than it answered. Because finding a missing item should bring relief. This did not. If anything,
illustrates, I believe, a fundamental difference between the upbringing of Princess Anne and Queen Camilla. For Princess Anne, there was always this certainty that her life would be dedicated to the service of the realm.
The discovery made the silence heavier. Anne reportedly looked at the robe, then at the records. And the difference between those two things was where the real problem began. The robe existed. It was there. Nobody could now claim that the search had simply failed to find it. But if the garment was where the records did not clearly say it should be, then another question immediately took its place. How long had it been there? Who had moved it? Who knew? And why was there reportedly no clear explanation ready the moment it was found? That is where this story stops being about a wardrobe, because clothing can be moved. Garments can be stored. Paperwork can be delayed. Mistakes can happen. But when the object in question carries the memory of a monarch's coronation, the margin for a casual explanation becomes very small. And Anne reportedly understood that. There was no need for her to make a speech. The discovery itself had already said enough. The robe had been found. But the palace records, according to the account, had not yet explained how it got there. And somewhere in that gap was the next part of the story. Because once Anne reportedly asked for the full inventory trail, the first answer did not clear Camilla's wardrobe. It pointed to something much more troubling. A record was missing. And if viewers believe the late Queen's legacy should not be swallowed by silence, then like, share, subscribe, and stay right here, because the next part is where this discovery gets far more serious and far more difficult to explain. The room did not erupt when the robe came out of the bag. That was the first thing that made the discovery feel more serious. According to the account, nobody screamed, nobody reached for a phone, and nobody rushed to explain what Princess Anne had just found. The people standing nearby simply stopped moving. For several seconds, the robe was the only thing anyone appeared able to look at. Anne reportedly did not touch it immediately. She stood over the garment while staff searched for words that would not come. The crimson fabric had already answered the first question. The item they had been trying to account for was no longer missing. It was there. But the second question landed harder. Why was it there? That question moved through the room before anyone dared to say it directly. A ceremonial garment associated with the late Queen was not supposed to become the subject of a guessing game. It should have a location. It should have documentation. It should have a clear chain showing where it had been and who had responsibility for it. According to the dramatic account, none of those answers appeared in front of Anne at that moment. The wardrobe around the robe made the discovery even stranger. Everything else had reportedly been arranged with purpose. Dresses had their places. Formal clothing had been stored according to use. Accessories had been separated and protected. The system, at least on the surface, looked controlled. Then there was the robe. It did not fit the pattern. That was the detail Anne allegedly kept returning to. The issue was not whether Queen Camilla owned a wardrobe full of expensive clothing. The issue was whether a historic ceremonial garment connected to Queen Elizabeth II had somehow ended up among personal items without the expected record explaining its presence. And that distinction changed the tone immediately. A misplaced handbag can be returned. A missing pair of gloves can be explained. But a coronation robe carries history with it. If the account is correct, Anne understood that the moment she saw the garment, she reportedly asked for the identifying details to be checked again. Staff compared what was physically in front of them with the information available in the inventory. The result did not settle the matter. It deepened it. The item could be identified. That much appeared clear within the story being told. Yet the records being examined allegedly did not immediately show a clean explanation for the robe's location inside Camilla's wardrobe. That is where the discovery became more than an embarrassing mistake. Because there is a difference between finding something in the wrong place and finding something in a place that appears difficult to explain. Now, this is the point where viewers need to decide what silence is worth. If a historic object connected to the late Queen can reportedly sit behind a locked door while nobody asks how it got there, then liking, sharing, and subscribing is not about cheering for gossip. It is about refusing to let uncomfortable questions disappear simply because the people involved are powerful. According to the account, Anne kept the focus on the records. That decision mattered. She did not reportedly begin by accusing Camilla of personally taking the robe. The available story does not establish that. It establishes a discovery, an inventory problem, and a confrontation with a location that required an explanation. Those are not the same thing. And the strongest part of this story is the uncertainty. Because uncertainty is exactly what everyone in that room was reportedly facing. Who had moved the robe? When had it been placed inside the wardrobe? Was the transfer temporary? Was it authorized but poorly recorded? Had the relevant paperwork been separated from the item? Or was there another explanation that nobody present was prepared to give? Each possibility created a different problem. Anne reportedly wanted the history of the garment, not an improvised answer. That meant going backwards, not from the wardrobe to the next royal event, but from the wardrobe to the last confirmed record. The search widened. Staff allegedly began checking references connected to the garment's previous location. Dates were compared. Storage information was revisited. The question was no longer simply where the robe was now. The question had become where it was supposed to have been before that morning. And somewhere between those 2 points, according to the dramatic account, the trail began to thin. That is the kind of detail that creates real tension inside an institution built on procedure. Royal ceremonies depend on symbolism, but institutions survive on records. A crown can be photographed. A robe can be admired. A royal appearance can be planned down to the minute. But none of that changes the importance of knowing who moved a protected item and under whose authority. Anne reportedly knew that a story could be told around the robe itself. It could be described as sentimental, symbolic, connected to continuity. Someone could argue that it had been placed there for an entirely innocent reason. The paperwork would be harder to charm away. A record either explained the movement or it did not. That was why the robe remained where it was while the questions continued. No one could simply fold it back into the bag and pretend the search had ended. The discovery had already crossed another line. More people now knew. More records were being requested. And with every additional person brought into the matter, the possibility of quietly closing the wardrobe and moving on became smaller. Then came another uncomfortable detail. According to the account, the garment did not appear to have been stored like an ordinary item waiting for routine use. The way it had been kept raised fresh questions about whether someone expected it to remain there for a significant period. That does not prove intent. It does not prove a secret plan, but it changes the shape of the mystery. Because if the robe had been placed there only briefly, why was its location allegedly difficult to reconcile with the records? And if it had been there longer, why had nobody corrected the discrepancy? Anne reportedly asked for the inventory trail again. This time, the request was more specific, not just the latest entry. Everything connected to the item, every transfer, every storage reference, every authorization associated with its movement. That was when the room reportedly became quieter than before. The robe had already been found. The danger now was what the paperwork might reveal, or fail to reveal. And there is a difference. A damaging document can create a scandal. A sulfur, a missing document, can create suspicion that lasts much longer, because absence gives everyone room to imagine what should have been there. One person may see incompetence. Another may see secrecy. Another may believe the robe was simply moved by someone who assumed the details would be handled later. But Anne, according to the account, was not prepared to choose a convenient explanation before the records were complete. That is where the pressure shifted. The wardrobe was no longer the center of the room. The missing trail was. And suddenly, the people who had been watching Anne open a door were waiting to see whether the next thing opened would be far more difficult to close. A file was reportedly requested. Then another. The search moved from fabric to paper. That may sound less dramatic, but it was the opposite. A robe can sit silently. Documents speak. Dates speak. Signatures speak. And when they do not exist, that silence can be louder than any argument. Anne reportedly waited as the information was gathered. There was still no public accusation, no official statement, no confirmed culprit. That matters, because the story becomes more compelling when the unanswered questions are allowed to remain unanswered, rather than being filled with easy blame. But one fact inside the dramatic account could not be pushed aside. The robe had been found somewhere it allegedly should not have been, and the explanation for how it got there was still incomplete. That was major twist number one. The missing object was not missing. It had been sitting in plain reach of the people closest to the mystery, hidden only by the fact that nobody had expected to look behind that particular door. But the discovery carried its own trap. Finding the robe did not solve the case. It opened it. Nobody in the room could dismiss that problem as a simple wardrobe mistake anymore. The robe had turned into a test of accountability, and every minute without a clear answer made the original discovery look less accidental and far more difficult for the palace to contain in public. The next search reportedly moved beyond the wardrobe and toward the people responsible for the item's last documented custody. That was where the story became even more uncomfortable. The question was no longer simply how the robe reached Camilla's wardrobe. It was who last signed for it, when that responsibility changed, and why the trail appeared to end before the garment was found. Anne reportedly asked for the name attached to the final clear record. The answer was not immediately available, and that delay changed everything. Because if viewers believe history should not be protected by silence, while ordinary people are expected to accept whatever explanation eventually appears, they need to like, share, subscribe, and stay, because the next search gets worse and more interesting as it leads straight toward the missing signature behind this robe. The name should have been there. That was the problem. According to the account, Princess Anne was no longer standing in front of Camilla's wardrobe when the next discovery emerged. The robe had already changed the direction of the morning. Now the attention had moved to the documents, and one missing name was beginning to matter almost as much as the garment itself. The final clear record did not immediately produce the person responsible for the robe's last confirmed transfer, and that was where the situation became far more difficult to dismiss. Because an item can be misplaced, a document can be filed incorrectly. But when the two problems appear together, the questions start multiplying. Anne reportedly asked again, who had last signed for the robe? Not who had seen it, not who believed they knew where it was, who had formally accepted responsibility for it. The answer, according to the dramatic account, was delayed. And inside a royal household, delay can carry its own meaning. Nobody needed to say that the missing name proved wrongdoing. It did not. There could have been an administrative failure, a record could have been archived incorrectly, an authorized movement could have been documented elsewhere. But Anne was reportedly unwilling to let possibility replace proof. That was the point when the search became more focused. Every available reference connected to the garment was allegedly pulled back into the conversation. Storage records were checked against earlier records. Dates were compared. Descriptions were reviewed again. The robe itself had not changed. The story around it had. Now, watch this carefully. The first discovery had raised one uncomfortable question. Why was the late Queen's coronation robe inside Camilla's wardrobe? The records introduced another. Who was supposed to know that it was there? And according to the account, those two questions refused to lead to the same answer. That was where Anne allegedly became more insistent. The people around her could reportedly explain procedures. They could describe how royal garments were normally handled. They could discuss the possibility of an error. But none of that answered the question in front of them. Where was the record that connected the robe's previous location to the place where Anne had found it? It was not enough to say that someone might eventually locate it. Anne reportedly wanted the answer now, because every passing minute created a new possibility. If the missing documentation appeared, the story could become an embarrassing administrative failure. If it did not, the discovery would become something much harder to explain. And this is where silence began working against everyone involved. No accusation had been proven. No culprit had been publicly identified. But the longer the paperwork failed to close the gap, the more attention shifted toward the gap itself. That is the danger of a missing record. People do not only ask what happened, they begin asking what someone hoped would never be checked. According to the account, Anne ordered the search to move backward through the robe's known history. That changed the process. Instead of starting with Camilla's wardrobe and trying to invent an explanation, the search reportedly began tracing the garment through its last confirmed points of custody. The idea was simple. Find the last place where the robe was unquestionably documented. Then move forward. Who handled it next? Where did it go? Who authorized the movement? At what point did the clear trail disappear? The answers, according to the dramatic account, did not come all at once. And that was precisely what made the story stronger. Each record seemed to answer one question while exposing another. The robe had been identified, but the location of its final documented custody did not immediately explain its presence inside the wardrobe. A reference appeared to connect the item to restricted storage. Another detail reportedly suggested that the garment had been reviewed or accessed after its earlier documented location. Then the trail became unclear. Not completely impossible to follow, just incomplete enough to cause concern. Anne allegedly noticed the difference. The robe had not vanished into thin air. Someone had moved it. That was obvious. The mystery was whether that movement had been properly recorded. And if it had, where was the record? This was no longer a question that could be answered with a quick phone call or an apologetic explanation. The story had reached the point where every person offering information had to consider what could later be checked. That changes behavior. People become careful. Words become shorter. And according to the account, that was exactly what began happening. Anne was reportedly receiving answers that explained the system without explaining the robe. That distinction frustrated her. A procedure is not proof that the procedure was followed. A rule is not evidence that someone obeyed it. And a locked wardrobe does not explain how a historic garment ended up behind its doors. The more carefully the situation was examined, the more the discovery appeared to sit between two very different possibilities. The first was ordinary but embarrassing. Someone with legitimate access had moved the robe and failed to ensure that the paperwork followed. The second was more troubling. The garment had been moved deliberately, while the explanation for that movement was left unclear. At that point, Anne reportedly refused to choose between the two. She wanted evidence. That decision is what pushed the story into its next stage. A broader set of records was allegedly requested, not just the inventory associated with the robe. Related references, associated storage lists, access information, anything that could show when the garment stopped appearing where it was expected and began appearing somewhere else. And then another detail surfaced. According to the account, the robe's absence from one expected location was not the only inconsistency. There was reportedly a second reference connected to the storage history that did not fit cleanly with the timeline. That changed the pressure again. Now, the question was not simply who moved the robe. It was, when did the records first stop telling the same story as the physical item? That is a much more dangerous question, because it pushes the investigation backward. The discovery inside Camilla's wardrobe may have been recent. The paperwork problem might not have been. And suddenly, the possibility emerged that the discrepancy could have existed longer than anyone initially believed. That does not establish a hidden operation. It does not prove Camilla knew anything about a missing record. But it creates a problem that cannot be solved by blaming the person who happened to discover the garment. Anne had reportedly opened a door. The documents were now opening another. And if viewers believe powerful people should not be allowed to bury uncomfortable questions beneath tradition and ceremony, then this is the moment to like, share, and subscribe. Doing nothing is easy. Asking who moved a piece of history and why the record disappeared is harder, but silence only protects the unanswered question. According to the account, Anne was not interested in protecting appearances at the expense of clarity. That made the situation uncomfortable for everyone. The easiest solution would have been to remove the robe, correct the inventory, and quietly return to the day's schedule. The problem was that the robe had already been found, and once a question has been asked in front of witnesses, pretending it was never asked becomes difficult. Anne reportedly wanted to know whether anyone had been informed about the robe's location before that morning. Again, the answer was not immediate. That hesitation mattered. If someone knew, why had the inventory not made the location clear? If nobody knew, who had access to move the garment? Either direction led toward another question, and every new question increased the stakes. The search was no longer about recovering a historic object. The object had already been recovered. The search was now about responsibility. That word carries weight inside any institution. Someone may not have intended harm. Someone may have made an error. Someone may have assumed another person was handling the paperwork, but responsibility still has a name attached to it. Anne reportedly understood that the moment could not remain permanently trapped between rumor and explanation. At some point, the palace would need a version of events, and whatever version eventually emerged would have to account for one undeniable part of the story. The robe had been found where the records had allegedly failed to place it. That was major twist number 2. The discovery inside the wardrobe had looked like the scandal. It was not. The real problem was the trail behind it. A robe can be returned to storage in an afternoon. A missing explanation cannot. And then, just as the search appeared to be narrowing around the paperwork, another detail reportedly entered the room. It came from the wardrobe itself, not from the robe, not from the inventory. From something that had been overlooked during the first search. Anne reportedly noticed an older storage marker connected to another item. At first glance, it seemed unimportant. A label, a reference, the kind of thing most people would ignore while everyone else was focused on a coronation robe. But Anne allegedly asked for it to be checked, and when the number was compared against the records, the atmosphere changed again. Because the reference did not appear to belong to the robe, it belonged to something else, something that raised the possibility that the wardrobe had been connected to more than one unexplained movement. Nobody had expected that. The discovery had begun with one historic garment. Now there was a suggestion, according to the account, that the wardrobe itself might contain evidence of a wider custody problem. Anne reportedly looked back toward the open section. The room had already been searched once, but now everyone was looking at it differently. The first search had been about finding the robe. The second was about understanding what else might have been moved, stored, or left undocumented. And that was when the story took its sharpest turn yet. Because opening Camilla's wardrobe may not have revealed the end of a mystery. It may have revealed the first sign that there was more inside the palace records than anyone had expected to uncover. If you think Princess Anne was right not to stop after finding the robe, then stand with the question by liking, sharing, subscribing, and staying here, because the next part turns from one hidden garment into a confrontation over legacy, responsibility, and a second discovery nobody in that room was prepared to explain. The second discovery changed the room before anyone fully understood what it meant. According to the account, Princess Anne was no longer looking at Camilla's wardrobe as the place where one unexplained garment had been found. The robe had opened the first question. The old storage reference had opened another. Now there were two problems sitting in front of the people trying to contain the situation. One was visible, the late Queen's coronation robe. The other existed on paper, a reference connected to something else. And according to the dramatic account, neither one fit comfortably into the explanation that should have ended the moment the wardrobe was opened. Anne reportedly asked for the second reference to be checked. Nobody rushed to answer. That hesitation was becoming a pattern. At first, the focus had been on locating the missing ceremonial garment. Then it shifted to the missing trail behind it. Now, a separate marker had raised the possibility that the robe was not the only item connected to a question about custody. That did not mean a second historic object had been found. It did not establish that more items were missing, but it was enough to make the search impossible to treat as a simple wardrobe error. The story had crossed into something larger, and that was when the tension reportedly moved toward Camilla herself. Until that point, the discovery had existed mostly between Anne, the staff, the open wardrobe, and the records being examined. But a question this sensitive could not remain separated forever from the person whose private collection had become the center of the controversy. According to the account, the atmosphere changed when Camilla was brought into the discussion. There was no need for shouting. In fact, shouting would have made the scene easier. Anger can be dismissed as emotion. Silence cannot. Anne reportedly stood her ground. The robe remained the central fact. It had been found. The records had allegedly failed to provide an immediate and complete explanation for its presence. And now, a second reference had complicated the situation further. Camilla, according to the dramatic version of events, was faced with a question no one in that room could answer on her behalf. How did the robe get into her wardrobe? That is where the story becomes more complicated than a simple accusation. Finding the robe inside Camilla's wardrobe does not, by itself, establish that she personally moved it there. The royal household involves staff, advisors, wardrobe personnel, and systems of access that can make responsibility difficult to trace from a single discovery. But the location still mattered. The wardrobe was hers. The door had been locked. And Anne had reportedly been the person who insisted that it be opened. Those facts created a confrontation that could not be avoided. Camilla could reportedly argue that the presence of the robe did not prove she had hidden it. Anne, on the other hand, did not need to prove intent before asking for an explanation. That was the difference between the two positions. One side could say, "Prove who did this." The other could answer, "First explain why it happened." And that is exactly where the power struggle became visible. If viewers believe powerful people should never be beyond uncomfortable questions, then liking, sharing, and subscribing matters here. Silence is easy when the doors belong to someone important. Speaking up is what forces those doors to open in the first place. According to the account, Anne did not allow the conversation to drift into personal arguments. That was important. The moment could easily have become Anne versus Camilla. The story was stronger than that. Anne allegedly kept returning to the same point. The garment needed an explanation, not a political explanation, not an emotional explanation, not a story about tradition or symbolism. A clear account of how it arrived there. That distinction reportedly made the room uncomfortable, because royal symbolism is powerful. It can transform a garment into a message. It can turn a photograph into a statement about continuity. It can connect one generation to another. But symbolism does not replace custody. A historic item can carry emotional meaning and still require documentation. That was the line at the center of the confrontation. According to the dramatic account, Camilla's position was connected to the idea of continuity. The robe was not merely fabric. It represented a connection to the institution, to history, and to the late Queen, whose reign had shaped the monarchy for decades. That argument, if it was made, carried obvious emotional weight. Camilla herself had participated in the modern monarchy's most significant ceremonial moments. She had stood beside King Charles as the institution moved from one reign into another. The idea that history and continuity mattered to her would not be difficult to understand. But Anne reportedly saw another side of the same argument. Continuity does not mean that everything from the past becomes available for the present. That was where legacy entered the room. A coronation robe is not simply valuable because of its fabric. Its importance comes from the moment attached to it, the person who wore it, the ceremony connected to it, the history that cannot be repeated. And according to the account, Anne was unwilling to let the discussion become blurred by the fact that royal objects can carry both personal and institutional meaning. The robe could be emotionally significant. That still did not answer the question of custody. The more the two sides of the issue became clear, the more difficult it became to reduce the discovery to gossip. This was not simply about whether Anne liked Camilla. It was not about whether Camilla had the right to own expensive clothing. It was about a line between private possession and historic legacy. And according to the account, that line had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Anne reportedly asked for the robe to be removed from the wardrobe while the documentation was reviewed. That was a turning point. The garment was no longer being treated as part of Camilla's personal collection. It was now the subject of an unresolved question. That alone changed the balance inside the room. The wardrobe had been opened. The robe had been found. The records had not fully explained its presence. And now the item itself was reportedly being separated from the place where Anne had discovered it. For Camilla, according to the dramatic account, that could not have been a comfortable moment. The object at the center of the controversy was being taken from her private space while Anne's questions remained unanswered. But the most difficult part had not even arrived. Because the second storage reference was still being examined. The first discovery had exposed the robe. The second threatened to expand the search. That possibility reportedly changed the conversation again. If one historic garment could appear in a location that was not clearly reflected in the records, what else might need to be checked? That was major twist number 3. The real danger was no longer the robe itself. The danger was what the robe could trigger: a wider review, more records, more questions, more doors, and that possibility was reportedly more unsettling than the discovery that had started the entire confrontation. Because once an institution begins checking its own records against its physical possessions, every discrepancy becomes important. A missing signature becomes important. A wrong date becomes important. A storage number that does not match becomes important. One unexplained item can lead to 10 more questions. Anne reportedly understood that. The discovery inside Camilla's wardrobe had created a decision. Either the matter could be explained with evidence, or the search would have to continue. There was no comfortable middle ground anymore. That was when Anne allegedly noticed something else. Not another robe, not a second garment pulled dramatically from the back of the wardrobe. Something smaller, something easier to overlook. A storage tag. According to the account, it was connected to the second reference that had already caused concern. Anne reportedly examined it again. The date attached to it did not appear to match the explanation that had been forming around the robe. And suddenly, the possibility emerged that the item had not simply been placed in the wardrobe at the last minute. It may have been connected to an earlier movement. That detail did not prove how long the robe had been there. It did not identify who had moved it, but it reportedly made one explanation harder to accept: the idea that this was merely a rushed mistake. The room was now facing a different possibility. That the robe's location could have existed long enough for someone to have noticed, and if nobody noticed, that raised questions about oversight. If someone did notice, that raised a different set of questions entirely. Anne reportedly did not speculate beyond the evidence. She returned to the same demand: find the trail. That was the strength of her position. She did not need to create a villain before the records spoke. She only needed to refuse to let the questions disappear. According to the account, the robe was prepared for removal from the wardrobe. The immediate discovery was being secured, but the second issue remained. And it had now become the reason the story could not simply end with the garment being returned to storage. The search had grown beyond Camilla's wardrobe. The next question was whether the palace would be willing to follow the trail wherever it led. That was the real confrontation. Not Anne standing against Camilla, Anne standing against the possibility that the easiest solution was to stop asking. Because institutions rarely fear the first question. They fear the second one. The first question asks what happened. The second asks who knew. And according to the dramatic account, the next stage of this story was about to move directly toward that second question. The robe could be secured. The wardrobe could be closed. The room could return to normal. But the missing explanation could not be locked away so easily. Anne had reportedly opened one door because the records did not make sense. Now the records themselves were leading toward another door. And this time, the answer could involve far more than what had been found inside Camilla's wardrobe. If you believe Princess Anne was right to keep pushing when everyone else had every reason to let the matter disappear, then like, share, subscribe, and stay, because the next part follows the unanswered trail beyond that wardrobe, and that is where the real question of who knew gets even harder to ignore. The wardrobe could be closed again. That was the strange part. According to the account, once the late Queen Elizabeth II's coronation robe had been removed and the immediate search moved beyond Camilla's private space, the room could physically return to normal. The doors could be shut. The garments could be arranged. The staff could continue with whatever had been interrupted. But closing the wardrobe did not close the question. And that was the final problem Princess Anne had reportedly created simply by refusing to walk away when the records stopped making sense. The title tells the audience exactly where this story begins. Princess Anne allegedly forced open Camilla's wardrobe and found the late Queen's coronation robe. But what the title cannot tell anyone is what happened after the robe was found, because the discovery was only the first answer. Everything that followed became a question of responsibility. According to the dramatic account, attention now shifted away from the wardrobe and toward the wider trail surrounding the garment. The robe itself could be secured, its condition could be checked, its location could be corrected. The missing explanation was another matter, and that was where the final stage of the story became uncomfortable for everyone involved. A historic object does not need to speak for itself. Its records are supposed to do that. Where it was stored, who handled it, when it moved, who approved the movement. Those details are what separate a protected object from an ordinary possession. According to the account, Princess Anne had forced the palace into a position where those questions could no longer be ignored. The simplest version of events would have been easy to create. Someone made a mistake. The robe was put in the wrong place. The records were incomplete. The matter was corrected. Everyone moved on. But that explanation reportedly faced a problem. The search had already uncovered more than one inconsistency. The original location did not clearly match the place where the robe was found. The transfer trail had allegedly failed to provide an immediate answer. Then, a separate storage reference had raised another question about whether the robe was connected to a wider issue of custody. At that point, calling everything a simple mistake became harder. Not impossible, harder. And Anne reportedly understood the difference. She did not need to claim that a conspiracy existed. She did not need to identify a culprit without evidence. All she had to do was keep asking for the record. That was enough. Because once the demand for proof replaced the demand for reassurance, the entire story changed. Nobody could simply say that the robe belonged where it had been found because it was connected to Camilla's household. Nobody could say that history was a matter of personal interpretation. The question had become factual. How did it get there? And according to the account, that question followed the robe even after it was removed from the wardrobe. This is where the opposition in this story becomes more complicated. It is not necessarily one person. It is not one locked door. It is not even one missing document. The real opposition is silence. The kind of silence that allows an uncomfortable question to become inconvenient, then private, then forgotten. And if viewers believe that history should not disappear simply because asking questions makes powerful people uncomfortable, then liking, sharing, and subscribing is their way of refusing that silence. Doing nothing allows the question to fade. Speaking up keeps it alive. According to the dramatic account, the robe was now being treated separately from the personal space where it had been discovered. That did not answer whether Camilla herself knew how it got there. The story does not establish that. It does not prove that she ordered anyone to move it. It does not prove that she attempted to conceal it. But the discovery inside her locked wardrobe ensured that the question could not be separated from her completely either. That is what made the situation so difficult. Camilla was left connected to a location. Anne was connected to the discovery. The staff were connected to the records. And somewhere between those 3 points was the missing explanation. The final search reportedly focused on who had knowledge of the garment's movement, not simply who had access. Knowledge. That word matters. Many people can enter a room. Many people can move clothing. Many people can assume someone else has completed the paperwork. But knowledge means something different. Who understood where the robe was? Who knew it had been removed from its previous location? Who knew it had entered a private wardrobe? And who, if anyone, believed that the records already explained the situation? Those questions were harder to answer, because unlike the robe, they could not be lifted from a wardrobe and placed on a table. They existed in conversations, in decisions, in routines, in documents that may or may not have been preserved. That was why the final mystery became larger than the first discovery. The robe was physical. The explanation was invisible. According to the account, this was the point where the possibility of a broader review became impossible to dismiss. Not necessarily a public investigation, not necessarily a scandal announced to the world, but a closer examination of whether other historic items had records that matched their actual locations. That possibility carried its own consequences. One discrepancy can be corrected. Several discrepancies become a pattern, and patterns force institutions to look at themselves. That was the risk created by Anne's decision to keep pushing. The moment the robe was found, the easiest response might have been to secure it and say nothing. But the second question was already waiting. If this one item had created a gap between physical custody and documented custody, what else had not been checked closely enough? That question reportedly hung over the final discussions. No one needed to accuse anyone. The possibility alone was enough to make the situation serious, because a royal institution is built partly on continuity of ceremonies, continuity of titles, continuity of tradition, but continuity also depends on memory, and memory becomes unreliable when records stop matching reality. That is why the robe mattered. It was not simply old fabric. It represented a moment that belonged to the history of the monarchy. A coronation cannot be repeated. The person who wore that robe cannot step back into Westminster Abbey and live that moment again. The late Queen's place in history is fixed. The objects connected to that history carry a different kind of responsibility because of it. According to the account, Anne's position remained rooted in that principle. Whatever explanation eventually emerged, the robe needed to be accounted for. And the palace needed to know how it had arrived where she found it. That was the point. Not revenge, not humiliation, not a public victory over Camilla. Accountability. And that distinction gives the story its final weight. Princess Anne reportedly did not set out that day to become the center of a royal controversy. She was dealing with a problem. Then the problem became a locked wardrobe. The locked wardrobe became a historic garment. The historic garment became an inventory question. And the inventory question became a test of whether anyone would continue searching once the easiest answer had been found. Anne did. That is what changed everything. The robe was no longer missing, but the truth behind its location remained unresolved. And in many ways, that was the more dangerous discovery. Because people can argue about motives forever. One person can claim carelessness, another can suspect secrecy, someone else can insist that there was a harmless explanation waiting to be found. But none of those arguments replaces documentation. That is where the story leaves the audience. Not with a confirmed villain, not with a proven conspiracy, but with a question that remains difficult to ignore. If a garment connected to Queen Elizabeth II's coronation was reportedly found inside a locked section of Camilla's wardrobe, why was there not an immediate and complete record explaining exactly how it got there? That is the question beneath the title. And it is the question that makes the discovery matter. The wardrobe was opened. The robe was found. The item could be secured. But the explanation could not be taken out of the room in the same way. It still had to be found. According to the account, the palace could continue with its routines after the discovery. Royal schedules do not stop because a difficult question appears behind a closed door. Engagements continue. Staff return to their duties. Public appearances move ahead. And that may be the most unsettling part. Outside, nothing necessarily changes. The public sees the familiar images. The ceremonies continue. The royal household appears controlled. But behind one set of doors, according to this account, Princess Anne had allegedly forced open a wardrobe and discovered a piece of history sitting where the records had failed to clearly place it. That creates two versions of the same day. The public version and the private question. The public version moves forward. The private question waits. And eventually, Someone has to decide whether waiting is enough. Anne reportedly made her own position clear through her actions. If the record did not make sense, the search continued. If the explanation was incomplete, the question remained open. And if the robe belonged to history rather than convenience, then history deserved to be protected properly. That is why the story has continued to attract attention. It is not only about Camilla. It is not only about Anne. It is about what happens when the person willing to ask the uncomfortable question finally finds something that should not be there. The real power of the story lies in what happened next. Nobody could put the robe back inside the wardrobe and claim the problem had never existed. Too many questions had already been raised. Too many details had been checked. And according to the dramatic account, the most important answer was still missing. Who moved it? When did the trail break? Who knew? Until those questions receive a clear answer, the discovery remains unfinished. And that may be the lasting image of this entire story. Not the wardrobe opening, not the crimson fabric, not the confrontation, but Princess Anne refusing to accept that finding the robe was enough. Because sometimes, the discovery is not the end of the story. Sometimes it is the moment when the real story finally begins. And if viewers believe Princess Anne was right to force the question into the open, instead of allowing silence to protect whatever happened behind that wardrobe door, then they should like this video, share it, subscribe to this channel, and turn on notifications, because staying silent only helps the unanswered questions survive, and the next story coming on this channel is even worse, more revealing, and far too important to miss.